G'day and welcome back to the Your Wellness Nerd channel. My name is Grant, I'm a physiotherapist, and today's video is for anyone struggling to solve lateral hip pain. And what I want to go through in this video is I want to talk about what lateral hip pain could be for you, but more importantly, some strategies that I've come to understand as a physio that you can implement that will hopefully help you solve and rectify those symptoms. So we're going to go through 5 exercises that you can do at home that should help to address some of the underlying causes of that dysfunction that you may not have been addressing, with the 5th exercise, one that I find a lot of people completely overlook and don't even look to attempt to change, that could genuinely be one of the most significant exercises to try to solve that lateral hip pain that you might have. But before we get to those exercises, obviously I'm sure you've noticed my poor excuse for a mustache. I'm currently participating in Movember, which is to help raise awareness for men's mental and physical health and well-being. And if you would like to help support a worthy cause, please consider going to the first link in the description below. And if you're in a position to donate, please do. I can't wait to get this off my face. So for a lot of people that I see clinically, the hidden underlying cause of a lot of lateral hip pain, whether it is a referred type pain, a genuine bursitis, or a gluteal muscle tear or a tendon dysfunction, is the function of your lower back. Now, I'll save the exercise to address that lower back dysfunction right to the end of the video, because I want to make sure that we don't neglect the symptomatic area that you have that needs to get looser, potentially needs to become stronger, or within the context of your pain and discomfort. None of these exercises should stir up or exacerbate your symptoms. If they do, we need to find a very genuine way around that. We need to take a balanced approach to make sure that the exercises that we're getting you to do are genuinely having an impact. They're either making you a little bit stronger or making your desired area a little bit more mobile, but we can't do that successfully if we're also stirring up and irritating your symptoms. And with a lot of lateral hip pain, we talk about cortisone injections and pain medications and things like that. But I think we often jump towards that a bit too quick before we actually attempt to rehab the area, to change the function and the way that those tissues are being loaded to support long-term sustainable progress. So the first exercise that I want to go through here involves trying to improve the mobility of your deep hip joint. And the reason why this is really important is because a lot of the structures at the side of that hip obviously work very closely with the function of the hip joint itself. And that hip joint is obviously a ball and a socket joint. If we were to wrap that ball and socket joint up in a plastic wrap, that's essentially what your hip joint capsule looks like. So that capsule can become stiff. So a really important exercise to try to begin with is to try and free up that hip joint a little bit more to improve the way that you're loading up that tissue. But we're going to be loading up that tissue while doing the stretch. So I want to stress with this exercise, it should not make your symptoms worse. If it does, we need to find a better version of this stretch to allow you to get some gains with this without stirring up your symptoms. And the best way to do this exercise essentially is to pop onto your hands and knees. Now, if you're someone who struggles to do this by getting down onto the ground or putting your knees on the ground, please consider putting something underneath your knees so that it feels more comfortable. You can also do this exercise in standing. You can do it leaning over a table or a bench with your legs straight. So basically what this stretch is, we want you to be on your hands and knees, and we want to imagine that your thigh bone is pressing through the back side of your hip joint to mobilize that stiff joint capsule. And we're going to do 3 different versions of this. The first one requires you to take your other leg back out the way so that we can put more body weight, more pressure through this hip. And keeping your shoulders and your hips together, all we want you to do is gently shift your trunk towards the side that you're trying to stretch until you feel a gentle pressure on the outside of that hip. You want to make sure that you explore the depths of your hip range. So if you feel you're about 90 degrees, and you can drop down a little bit deeper, please do. Again, it shouldn't hurt your lateral hip. It should feel like a pressure or a nice gentle stretch. If it does, come out of that depth a little bit more. Don't go as far across into the stretch. Try and find a version of this stretch that feels comfortable for you. And then the second version of this is the exact same thing, but we're going to rotate your hip around and then bend your back knee to block that position. And what we're doing here is we're trying to put your hip joint capsule in a more externally rotated position before we do the same thing that we did before when we're shifting across towards that side. The reason why this is important, it just hits a different part of that joint capsule. This version might feel more comfortable for you because you shouldn't feel it in the lateral hip as much. You should feel this more in towards the middle of your butt cheek. And then we want to hang out here again for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever you feel comfortable with, allowing that tissue to give and allowing that tissue to move. And then again, the third variation of this stretch is the same thing that we did before. Instead of rotating under, we're going to rotate outwards into an internally rotated position. and then coming across and repeating the same stretch that we did before. This time, the pressure should be more up towards the front of the hip, again, away from the lateral hip. This might be more comfortable for you depending on where you might be. If you feel like it jams up a little bit, or if you feel like you get some groin dysfunction, just don't be as deep into that hip stretch. Come out of that position a little bit more before coming across to that side. And so what I want to stress with this exercise is this exercise may have the potential to annoy the side of your hip if you aren't doing it correctly, or if you're pushing it too far into that stretch. But what you should notice straight away is that just by putting some gentle pressure through that hip joint capsule, it should immediately feel looser and freer. And the reason why this is important is because if your hip joint is stiff, then all the tissue around that hip joint can't be loaded up normally or in a way that's healthy for that tissue. And then the second exercise that we can do is that we can take a ball of some sort, whether it's a tennis ball or in this case a lacrosse ball, and we can respectfully place the ball into the tissue around that side of the hip. Again, paying close attention to where your specific symptoms might be and how tender that may be for you. And how that can look for you is if you gently come onto your side. So again, you don't have to go straight to where you feel your symptoms because it may be too sore, it may be tender, it may even be damaged if you have a gluteal muscular tear. But we just want to make sure that we're finding spots that feel very safe and very comfortable to be on, and then gently allowing the ball to press in for about a minute or two, just getting that tissue to give, get that muscle reflex happening where your tissue starts to give a little bit. What you can do if this is comfortable is you can gently tense that tissue up for a little bit. This gets your brain involved so that when you stop tensing that after about 5 seconds, the tissue should separate and relax as a reflex. You should find the ball gently sinks in a little bit further. Then once you've had enough of that spot, you can move on to the next area that feels a little bit tender. Again, it doesn't have to be right on where you hurt. We're looking for anything around that area that's tight, stiff, and restricted that shouldn't be there. Another thing that you can do once you've done some sort of contract, relax over the top is that once you've found a tight spot, we can incorporate some movement through the area, whether it's hip flexion and extension. We're creating some internal, external rotation to compress that tight tissue and shear that tissue past the ball. Again, encouraging that soft tissue to free up and mobilize in a way that gentle stretching may not necessarily be doing for you. So once you spend some time trying to mobilize the hip joint and mobilize some of the tissue around that hip in order to feed some slack into your painful lateral hip, the second two exercises are going to focus on muscular strength. The idea here is obviously that the stronger we can make your gluteal muscles, the more supported your lateral hip is, the better it starts to function, the more normal the loading of that area becomes. But if you have lateral hip pain, it's really important to remember that in the process of strengthening these muscles, we don't want to exacerbate or irritate your symptoms. So the first of the two strength exercises is simply a clam-based exercise. And what this basically is if you bend your hips and knees up, keeping your heels together, what we're trying to do here is keeping your trunk relatively vertical, if not a fraction forwards. If you dig your fingers just behind that greater trochanter, that hip bone at the side of your hip, you'll find that these muscles, these hip external rotators, the ones that lift your knee up in this position, should activate along the way. So again, these hip external rotators aren't necessarily the ones that generate that lateral hip pain, but they're hugely important in supporting normal hip function to create an environment for that lateral hip to succeed as opposed to one where it might be failing currently. Just bring it up high enough so that you don't feel like you're rolling backwards, but you also feel some good fatigue through that hip. Now, if you're someone that finds that this exacerbates some of your lateral hip symptoms, what we can do instead is instead of moving through that range, we can get you to lift your knee up and hold that position in an isometric contraction for 5 seconds, for 10 seconds, for as long as it takes for you to fatigue that muscle, to feel a burn, and then come back down again. And over time, that should continue to get easier for you and support the function of that hip better. And then the second exercise that we want to go through here is more of a straight leg raise. So being at our side again, what we want to do is we want to have our legs out straight. And same thing as the previous exercise where we don't want to roll back too much. We want to make sure that we're rolling forwards a little bit so that when we lift our legs straight up to the side, we're not rolling back and using the muscles at the front of the hip. Make sure that you're vertical, hips roll forward a fraction, lead with your heel and come up as high as you feel you can before you start to cheat and roll around. And as we did with the clams, if you feel like repetitions become too irritable for the side of that hip, you're welcome just to lift that up a little bit and try and hold on for dear life for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, as long as it takes for you to feel a gentle or a significant burn through the side of that hip, whatever feels comfortable and asymptomatic, with the expectation that over the next 1 to 2 weeks, you should feel like this consistently gets easier and easier and easier and allows that lateral hip to function better and provide a better environment for that pain to begin to settle. So the final exercise that I think we need to touch on here, in my opinion, is potentially the most impactful, or at the very least, the one that's overlooked or completely missed the most. And that is lower back stiffness. And this is a really important topic to talk about because you don't have to have a sore back to have back dysfunction. The joints in your back, the tissue in your back can still be stiff, restricted, tight, and dysfunctional in the absence of pain altogether. Because what I find clinically is that so many people who have that lateral hip pain in the form of a gluteal tendon issue, a muscle issue, general bursitis, or just non-specific lateral hip pain have undiagnosed lower back dysfunction, the underlying cause of why that lateral hip pain has become sore. We have a number of different neural connections between individual spinal segments of our lower back and the base of our rib cage that can express themselves to different parts of the legs and hips that gets completely missed in a lot of cases. So what I urge you to try from this video is that if you can take, again, a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball, or if you have a foam roller, either of these two would work. We want to take the ball or the roller and go hunting through the lower aspects of your back for clues as to some hidden lower back stiffness or dysfunction that might be referring some pain to the lateral hip, or at the very least inhibiting in some way the function of the muscles in that hip that may have preceded that muscle tear or that tendonitis that you might be dealing with. So a great way to do this, as we always do on the channel, is you want to take the ball, you want to place the ball at the base of your rib cage, starting on the same side as the dysfunction that you have through your hip. So for the purposes of this, let's imagine that the lateral hip on the left-hand side is uncomfortable for me. I'm going to have the ball just to the left-hand side of my spine at about the base of the rib cage. And some of you may lie down straight away and find a whole range of stiffness and tenderness here that you had no idea was there. What we want to look for is we want to move the ball around gently until you find something that feels a bit stiff, tight, or tender. Take note of how that feels, and then I need you to roll the ball straight across to the other side, the exact same spot, and compare how that feels. And what you'll hopefully find is that both sides feel different. But what I want to get you to look for here is looking for that hidden stiffness and tightness that could be that hidden feature associated with why your lateral hip pain is there. Now what I want you to do is, once you've found a spot that you think is a little bit tight, a little bit tender, I just want you to let the ball press into that exact spot for a minute or two, allow that tissue to give. Once you've had enough of that, then just gently move the ball down a little bit or out a little bit, go hunting for the next spot that you feel is important. If you genuinely feel some pain generated where you feel your symptoms at the side of the hip, that is not a coincidence, that's not in your head, that is a tangible connection that you've just found. It might be coming from a part of your back that you had no reason to consider before because it didn't hurt walking around living your life. But it's genuinely one of the most overlooked and sort of underappreciated parts of why I think we tend to get lateral hip pain, and something that you must address if you're trying to set yourself up for long-term success into the future. So I genuinely hope that was helpful, as I said. If it was, please consider leaving a like rating on the video, subscribe if you're new. Please check out the Movember link if you'd like to support men's health. But despite all that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.